Hi, recall, innovation starts with an idea, right? So there's an idea, then other things happen and then adoption happens, but if that idea isn't very good, then that's a constraint. That's something that's going to stop us from being innovative. So that's where we want to start this week. We're going to talk about perception, that is getting information in. We're going to talk about intellection, that is how we think about things, the way we put information together. And we're going to talk about expression, that we are articulating our ideas. How do we get our ideas back out into the world? We're also going to talk a little bit about motivation and process, like what do those things have to do with it? What do I have to do? What are the steps I could do actually to make myself much more innovative than usual? All right, let's go get right into it. I want to start with a story this week, a story of Spence Silver. Spence Silver was this young man in 1966. He had finished his PhD in chemistry, and he joined the R&D division of this let's say a big, diverse entrepreneurial products firm. And so in 1968, 2 years later, he was working on in one of the labs. He was trying to make he said in his words, he was fooling around. And what he wanted to do was to take some of the company's established technologies and make them much better, to make like a super version of their current technology. Unfortunately, the product that he came up with, in the end, it couldn't compete. It was, in many words, in some places, it was just not good. He thought it might be interesting to play with. However, his colleagues, though, they said, throw it away. It's not very good. But instead of throwing it away, Spence Silver, he just kept insisting on showing the thing to everyone. He kept showing it around and showing it around and say, hey, look at this thing. I have this glue. Basically, the thing that he was working on was this product that didn't work very well. I have this thing that doesn't work very well, not as good as our current products, but isn't this interesting? And so he kept showing it around and showing it around and showing it around. Over 5 years, he was showing this thing around. And he kept working on this product. He kept working on trying to make this thing to figure out how could he use it. It didn't perform as well as the flagship product of this company, but it had different properties than that. And it was sort of different in a way, and so they couldn't figure out what it was. So in this company, they had a strong culture of sharing ideas. And so they'd have maybe a weekly meeting, or a weekly seminar where people can get together and say, here's what I've been working on this week, or a monthly seminar, maybe that's organization-wide, here's what I've been working on this month. And they would basically show these things around inside. So again, for 5 years, Spence Silver is showing this thing around inside. He really does not know what to do with it. He's been asked to stop working on it, but he won't take no for an answer, and he just keeps on going, trying to find people, trying to find people, trying to find people. Asking them, do they have a use for this technology? Unfortunately, they didn't. Sometime later, so remember this is going on for many years now, Art Fry, who's another employee inside the company, he realized that he had a problem that Silver's invention could solve. And he had seen him at one of these seminars, I assume, and this guy had this hobby of choir singing. And this product that Spence Silver had come up with could help him with that hobby, could help him organize these sheets of music for his choir, and he was really excited about that. So the two began trying to develop a prototype. Now inside of the company, they'd said this thing doesn't work, it's not a very good product, like what are you thinking, throw the thing away. They said, no, make us a prototype. Well, the manufacturing part of the organization thought the prototype was just too difficult to make, and so they said, we're not going to help you with that, you're on your own. So, again, years are passing by, and this unauthorized project is still being worked on, but now they've worked on it in Spence Silver's basement. So they built a prototyping facility there. So they've been able to develop a prototyping and then a little bit of manufacturing, and still, they try to make this thing work. They try to get people interested in this thing. And so finally, he figured out he could only give the things away inside the organization. Because they tried market tests. Market tests, you can imagine what this is. So I'll give away the name of the company now. This was 3M, and what he invented was a Post-it note. And so he had this old product that was a piece of paper too small to write on, with bad adhesive. The adhesive is what Spence Silver had invented. So let's do a market study. Sir, are you interested in a small piece of paper too small to write on with terrible adhesive on the back? No, of course not. So people who had been asked in a survey whether they wanted this thing were not interested at all. But people who had used them, tried them out, they loved them. And so they had to keep trying to get the market study people to understand what they were seeing. The people who were actually using it were loving this thing. So again, now it goes off, there's another market trial. People didn't see the value of it because again, they're asking in this wrong way, and people wouldn't bite on it. And so finally the marketing department said, look, we're not going to do this anymore. Let's just stop. What do? Well, they keep going, they keep pushing, they keep pushing. So this again is Spence Silver and Art Fry are pushing this thing forward, and finally they appeal to the CEO and say, hey, we have this great product, it's really important, it could be a really good thing, let's do another market strategy. Please help us do another market test for this product. And so in Boise, Idaho, they did their test. In that test, they found that basically 90% of the people who tried the product, who actually tried it, loved it and they would buy it. And so finally it was given the official go-ahead. And so in June 1980, again, this is 12 long years after Silver accidentally discovered the invention of this sort of inferior adhesive. 3M was about adhesives, and he made a dud adhesive. Finally, the product that he invented for 3M, the Post-it, was finally launched 12 years later. So this brings up some kind of questions that we may want to be interested in. For example, what motivates a person like Silver to keep working on a project? The project has failed, it's unauthorized, and he keeps working on it for over 5 years by himself. What enabled him to see that there was something there, that he kept seeing something there and kept working on it? Other people just saw a failed experiment. He saw something. How is that? Why did some people, and why do some people in general, continue to work really hard and push on projects and go on through, while others sort of give up at the first sign of rejection or resistance from others? Another question, was 3M lucky to find Silver? Did he possess some kind of secret quality? Was there something about his personality, something that the company knew and they identified early in him and hired him for that reason? Or was it random? I mean, was it just something else? Let's ask the question about Silver's creative abilities. Are they genetic? Is it only him? Or does everyone have these things? Can anyone do these things? And finally, why on earth was the guy not fired? I mean, someone working for 12 years on a project that's unauthorized, that no one sees any value in, should be gone. Well, at least that's the mistake 3M did not make. Let's say you wanted to find a creative person. What would you look for? How could you find a creative person? Is it their personality? Is it something genetic? Is it something in their behavior? And so this is a really interesting question. And it's been a question that psychologists have studied for a long time. In general, common wisdom and early research suggested that creatively performing individuals, that is people who are able to do creative tasks, they tend to have broad interests, they tend to seek complexity, that they're looking for more complex things, they're intuitive, they can work off their gut, they're aesthetically sensitive, they're ambiguity tolerant, and they're also self-confident. And these are the kind of the features that are part of what a individual will have. There's a question of whether creative individuals are born or made. The kind of things I just talked about, these kind of things that we just talked about, are not personality traits. They're not actually a part of your personality. The personality being the thing that then stays stable over time. So if I measure you today and I measure you tomorrow or a year from now, that you would be measured the same on those traits. And those traits, aesthetic sensitivity, is not something that psychologists call a personality trait. And so despite 100 years of study, there's not really been a great finding, that is, we're not absolutely certain that there's this thing called a creative personality. In fact, we're pretty certain that there's not a thing called a creative personality. And so what about that? I want to think about that. Personality, for psychologists, personality is defined into these sort of 5 personality traits. One is agreeableness, to what extent you go along with others and you get along with others. Extroversion, externally oriented, to the extent that you bring, you gain energy from the outside. Neuroticism, to what extent you worry and that you're nervous about things. Conscientiousness, that's sort of follow through, persistence, and openness. To what extent are you open to new experiences? And so among these big 5, there's not one called creative or creativity. Although you may have some suspicion that some of these are related to creativity, in fact. Well, here's a chart that shows a study that was done. And the study basically had people, it measured their part of their personality, and then had them do a creative task. And so what they tried to do was say, is that element of your personality related to your ability to do creative tasks? Remember, there are these 5 things that are there, these 5 possibilities for what drives creativity. And so we can see here that agreeableness, to what extent they were agreeable, had no correlation. This is a correlation chart, had no correlation with creative output. So that is to say, if someone was very high in agreeableness, as based on the personality test, it did not matter if they were high or low with respect to how much creative output they had. The second one does have some correlation. And so we can see here that at 0.12, somewhere in there, that extroversion actually does seem to have some correlation with creative output. So people who are more extroverted tend to have a little bit more creative output. Next we see neuroticism. Neuroticism is negatively correlated with creative output. Why would that be? Well, maybe it's because, we'll go ahead and think about it for a moment. Maybe it's because people were worried about the experiment, they were worried about other people. When we were trying to do something creative, we're sort of constantly second-guessing ourselves, and that would make us a little bit less creative. Then we have this conscientiousness. It seems pretty high, actually. The conscientiousness, the follow-through, the persistence seem to have a fair amount more of correlation with creative output. And then also openness. So it looks like of the 5 personality traits, we have 3 of them that are actually somewhat correlated with creative output. The only problem is that these correlations are not very strong. And so if you know statistics, if you go into statistics and do this kind of research, you'll see that R squared of 0.1, right, where you see where 0.1 is barely significant. It's really barely above the level of noise. And so although there's something here, it's not very strong. And so it really doesn't tell us what the secret is to make a person creative. Let me add one column in this chart. So again, when the researchers did this study, they measured people based on these personality traits, and they also added another measure. And this measure was called cognitive ability, the thing we call IQ, basically how smart they are as far as we measure those. And all of a sudden we see a much larger correlation. So being smart actually is more important than being neurotic, than being open, than being extroverted, than being all these other things with respect to creative output. Isn't that interesting? So there's something that we possibly can do. But can we change our smartness? Can we change what our IQ is? Well, I think at least creativity, we don't want to, okay. I think we don't want to say that creativity is an attribute of our personality in any kind of technical sense, right? So there's not a thing in the way that personality is measured by psychologists that creative is part of that. What we want to do is think about another way of thinking about it. What research suggests is the way that we think, the habits of perception, how it is we bring information into our brain, how it is we think different thoughts. So remember, IQ was correlated, and so IQ maybe has something to do with that. And specifically, what it is that the power to be creative is going to come down to 3 basic things. Perception. So perception is about getting information in, that if I want to have ideas, that's on the basis of something. We call that that data, that information. And so perception is the most important thing to get information in. Once I have the information in, I have to think about it. I have to put it together in different ways and say, oh, I saw this here and I saw that there. How do I bring them together into a new idea? So thinking is a part of it also. Then finally, an idea does no good in your head and it has to come out. And that's what we're going to call expression. How do I get my ideas out of my head? And without being able to bring information in, without thinking about things in a different way, and without expressing our ideas, we're not going to get to a new place. And so what we want to think about is what can go wrong in each of these and how it is that we can sort of protect ourselves against things going wrong in each of these cases. So here's a picture of the model and how we're going to think about it. Perception, bringing information in. Intellection, how we think things through. And expression, how it is we put our ideas back out into the world for other people to see, to judge, and to test.